Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and it's good to see you all here. So during the past few weeks, we've been talking about the precepts. There are, in the Soto Zen tradition, there are 16 traditional precepts, including the 10 so-called prohibitory precepts. And we've been focusing on them. And we're up to precept number 4 of the 10 prohibitory precepts. And Dogen, in his fascicle on the precepts, states this precept rather simply: not to make false statements. Not to make false statements. So there are other versions of this precept that we can refer to, or commentaries on this precept. First of all, the precept as stated in the Brahmanet Sutra, which is probably from the source from which Dogen derived his precepts, since there are also 10 major precepts there. And in the Brahmanet Sutra, this precept is stated: a disciple of the Buddha must not himself use false words and speech, or encourage others to lie, or lie by expedient means. He should not involve himself in the causes, conditions, methods, or karma of lying, saying that he has seen what he has not seen, or vice versa, saying that he has not seen what he has seen, or lying implicitly through physical or mental means, such as nodding or shaking your head, or remaining silent when someone asks you whether you have seen something that you have actually seen, or the other way around. So some other statements of this precept. Bodhidharma talks about it this way: self-nature is subtle and mysterious. In the realm of the inexplicable Dharma, not preaching a single word is called the precept of not lying. Not preaching a single word is called the precept of not lying. And Dogen, in another commentary on the precepts, talks about the Dharma wheel turns from the beginning. There is neither surplus nor lack. The whole universe is moistened with nectar, and the truth is ready to harvest. Zen peacemakers refer to this precept this way: listening and speaking from the heart. This is the precept of non-lying. So they speak of it in a positive way. Listening and speaking from the heart. This is the precept of not lying. So I thought to refer to a text on the precept of not lying, I would go to the Ambala Tika Rahula Vada Sutta. And that is, that basically means the exposition to Rahula. So first of all, a little bit about who was Rahula. Many of you may know that Rahula was Buddha's son, his only son, his firstborn. And as the story goes, the circumstances of Rahula's birth were along these lines. Siddhartha, before he became the Buddha, Siddhartha, who had been largely, almost exclusively confined to the palace, that was the intent of his father, the king, to prevent Siddhartha from being exposed to some of the realities in the world. He had been confined for years and years, and now at, I guess, about 29 years of age, he had talked the driver into taking him into town. And this happened to be at the very end of his wife, Yasudhara's pregnancy. So he went into town with the driver, and on this trip, as the story goes, he saw a decrepit old person. He'd never seen such a thing. And then he saw a very sick person, never seen such a thing. And then he saw a corpse. He'd certainly never seen such a thing. But then he saw an ascetic seeker, a spiritual seeker, a wandering spiritual seeker. And there were many such individuals, I guess, in India at this time. And seeing this seeker, he was inspired and recognized right away that that was his destiny. To seek answers to the problems of human suffering that he had witnessed. But when he returned to the palace, the staffer came up to him and said, "Oh, rejoice, Prince, you are given a son. Your wife, Yasudhara, has delivered a son." And the Buddha's response to this, as the story goes, was, "A fetter has been born, a bondage has been born." An odd response to a new father, But remember, he had this life-changing experience during the day and committed himself to spiritual pursuit. Well, that night, while his wife and his son, who was then called Rahula, which means actually fetter, were sleeping, he left the palace and started his 6-year-long sojourn of ascetic practice that led to his awakening. So after about 1 year after his awakening, and when he had a small entourage of followers, he returned to the palace and there confronted his wife and son. And his wife, and you can sort of fill in the blanks here when you hear what she said to Rahula, his son. She said, That is your father, Rahula. Go ask him for your inheritance. Now, the Buddha, at this point, was, of course, dressed in a robe made of rags, and he was carrying a begging bowl. So it was sort of a clever maneuver on the part of Yasudhara. But Rahula, being an obedient son, went up and did this. He said, "Father, where is my inheritance?" And at that point, the Buddha turned to Shariputra, one of his follower monks, and said, "Ordain this young man." So Rahula was ordained there right on the spot and became a novice monk. So Rahula joined the group of monks following the Buddha around as they wandered from place to place. And one time, Rahula saw his father, the Buddha, approaching him to speak with him. And Rahula, being an obedient novice monk, prepared a seat for his teacher, his father, and also prepared a little bowl of water so that his father could wash his feet. And then the Buddha came, sat down. Rahula sat respectfully at his side, and the Buddha washed his feet using almost all of the water. And then he asked Rahula, "How much water is left in the bowl?" And Rahula said, "Only a small amount." And the Buddha said, "Yes, Rahula, the practice of a monk who is not shamed by telling a deliberate lie is small and insignificant. Small and insignificant is practice." And then the Buddha turned the bowl upside down and said, "What is the condition of the bowl now, Rahula?" And Rahula said, "The bowl is empty." And the Buddha said, "Empty is the practice of a monk who is not ashamed of telling a deliberate lie." And then he put the bowl down and off to the side and said, "Rahula, what is the condition of the bowl now?" "Well, you have discarded the bowl." And the Buddha said, "Yes, Rahula, the practice of a monk who is not ashamed of telling a deliberate lie is discarded." Something along those lines. Remember, he was talking to a 7-year-old child now, so he was using a very physical image to explain his point. But it's interesting that the Buddha chose this topic as the first instruction to his son, the novice monk. He goes on at the same time, though, and gives a second little lesson related. And the second little lesson has to do with skillful and unskillful actions of body, speech, and mind. So he asks Rahula what a mirror is used for. And Rahula says, well, it's for reflecting. It's for reflecting images. Rahula was a bright little boy. And then the Buddha goes on and talks about reflecting on actions of body, speech, and mind before they're committed, while they're being committed, and afterwards. And for example, a section from the sutra. Whatever action you desire to do by word, Rahula, of that particular verbal action, you should reflect. Now, this action that I desire to do by word, would this, my verbal action, be conducive to my own harm, or to the harm of others, or to that of both? Then, unskillful is the verbal action, entailing suffering and productive of pain. If, on the other hand, Rahula, when reflecting, you realize that this action I desire to do by word is neither conducive to my own harm, nor the harm of others, nor to that of both, hence, skillful is this verbal action, entailing pleasure and productive of happiness. For that very reason, Rahula, should you abide in joy and happiness, training yourself day and night in meritorious states. So the Buddha emphasizes self-reflection on one's actions before, during, and after. Actions of body, speech, and mind. But his very first lesson had to do with lying. Because, as the Buddha said, similarly, Rahula, I say, of anyone who is not ashamed of uttering deliberate lies, that there is no evil that could not be done by him or her. Accordingly, Rahula, should you train yourself, not even in play, will I tell a lie. So reflecting before, during, and after. Why so much reflection? I think one thing is that this formula that the Buddha is using for essentially defining right and wrong, or more accurately, skillful and unskillful, some of you may recognize as being, basically a utilitarian theory of morality. And one issue with utilitarianism is that you can't always predict the consequences of your actions. You do your best. So you try to understand whether this is going to result in benefit to yourself and others. And then as you're performing the action, you can reflect on whether this is working or not, whether it's having the intended effect. And of course, afterwards, you can reflect on whether you were accurate in your prediction, or whether you were mistaken, and can learn from this and not make a similar mistake in the future. So later on in the suttas, the Buddha goes into more detail about right speech or skillful speech, and talks not only about lying, but about asking the 5 questions. Is what I am about to say, is it true? Is it timely? Is it spoken with kindness? Is it spoken with goodwill? And is it beneficial? And again, we don't always know in advance, but we do our best and assess the situation as time goes on. Well, this in some ways sounds straightforward, but as we all know, it's not. Are there situations where lying is skillful? For instance, in the Lotus Sutra, there's the story of the father who is outside and his house is burning and his 3 children are inside and his 3 children are playing and he's trying to coax them out. It's impossible for him to go in. The entryway is such that he cannot go in to save the children. So he's calling to them, screaming to them to come out of the house, jump out the window. They don't respond. Of course, children sometimes don't. They're involved in their play. And then the father knows that his 3 sons have special preferences regarding animals. And one of them is very fond of goats, and another very fond of deer, and another very fond of oxen. So he says, I have 3 carts out here, one carried by a goat, another by a deer, another by an ox. Come out and see your carts. And his children then respond, come out of the burning house. And he doesn't actually have 3 carts with those 3 animals. He has something else. That's sort of another story, but it's obviously an act of deception in order to save the lives of his children. And there are other examples that readily come to mind. You can think about, the classic thing of, when the SS officer comes to the door and asks, is there anybody in your house? And you have a family, a Jewish family, hiding under the floorboards. So is it, and there are sort of less serious examples too of, when you get the question, do you like my new dress? Is it always skillful to say exactly what you happen to be feeling about things at the time? Sort of a la 1960s sensitivity groups where people were encouraged to just say what came to their mind without additional processing. And it often ended up like the Larry King show. So the issue of lying can be, I think, perhaps more complicated than just having a simple statement, never tell a lie. But I guess I'd offer as a question, what complications do you see in this precept? How can it be useful to you? And why was it the very first lesson that the Buddha chose to teach his son? So I'll stop there. went on a little longer than I intended, and we'll break up into groups shortly